Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Rausan Pereira. The UN General Assembly President has recommended that heads of state and government and ministers address the UNGA session in September through pre-recorded video statements as COVID-19 related restrictions on international travel and large in-person meetings are likely to be in place in the coming months. The new format will mean that it will be for the first time in the World Organization's 75-year history that heads of state and governments will not gather in New York for the UNGA session. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze virtual diplomacy and the way forward. Joining me on the program today are Jitendra Nath Misra, former ambassador, Rajendra Harshe, foreign affairs expert, and Yoshita Singh, chief correspondent, PTI, New York. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Yoshita, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's analyze the UN, the president's statement really as far as the UN General Assembly is concerned. What are the biggest concern really as far as so many heads of state and heads of government gathering in New York is concerned, and what was the big concern there?
Right. So thank you for having me on the show, Frank. We all know that the UN General Assembly is the highlight of the year in New York. At the UN headquarters, we have heads of state and government and ministers from 193 UN member states descending on New York for a week of diplomacy, speeches, meetings, multilateral and bilateral meetings. But this year, given the COVID-19 pandemic, it's very tough that these heads of state and governments will be able to travel to New York for the General Assembly. I mean, the president of the General Assembly, Mr. Muhammad-Bande, said a president does not travel alone. A head of state comes with a whole contingent of officials, of diplomats, security personnel, and to imagine that in this year, with the coronavirus pandemic, it's highly unlikely that the UN General Assembly will be conducted the way it has been in the last 74 years. It's a pity because this year would have been the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. It would have meant that a lot of these ministers and heads of state, prime ministers, presidents would have come to commemorate this milestone year for the UN. But now with the COVID pandemic, like I said, it's looking tough because obviously we also have to see the security concerns also. When presidents and prime ministers come to New York, the hotel bookings, a lot of logistics has to be in play. It's not just one person traveling. I mean, there are hotel arrangements, there are security arrangements, logistics around the UN building. I mean, and at this point of time, clearly you can't have thousands of people walking in the UN building when we have to maintain social distancing because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Absolutely. So the coronavirus pandemic, Ambassador, has changed many things for us. And one such is, of course, diplomacy as well. And we've seen countries and leaders around the world adapt to the situation and bring in a new form of diplomacy too, along with a host of other things.
Yes, absolutely. But the more things change, the more they remain the same in certain ways. I'll give you some examples from my own experiences and observation, and I've written about it. Let's take the example of the election of Judge Dalbir Bhandari, and you would know about that, in 2017 to the International Court of Justice. He was pitted against Christopher Greenwood of the United Kingdom, and he defeated Judge Greenwood. How did it happen? Now, here is a scenario of actual diplomacy, of actual people interacting, actual lobbying in the corridors, in the slippery pathways of the United Nations. All that happened. 11 rounds. Now, you have to win both the Security Council as well as the General Assembly to be voted. Christopher Greenwood, he won in the Security Council, and Judge Dalbir Bhandari, won in the General Assembly. So it was a stalemate. And eventually, bowing to tradition, Judge Greenwood stepped down. Britain stepped down because the tradition is that if you can't carry it in the General Assembly, you step down. Now, what might have happened at that time? What might have happened is that there would have been intense lobbying by both the sides. Well, Britain is a permanent member of the Security Council, so it was a given that at least out of nostalgia, courtesy, and self-preservation, the other four would not vote against the British candidate. But in the General Assembly, the mood was different. India is a rising power, and Britain is a relatively declining power. It's a diminishing power. So the world has to take notice of the changed realities. And this was an opportunity to score a point over a P5. And this is probably what the Indian delegation might have worked towards. And it's not about the merits of the judges, but it's about the lobbying. Now, as I said, my opening remark was that the more things seem to be different, the more they are the same. Now, imagine if this election would have taken place during the now transformed 75th session of the General Assembly in the virtual space. Now, one can speculate, but once again, it is the power and influence and relative strength of the candidates in terms of the strength of the countries, not the individuals, that counts. You know, the same day that Christopher Greenwood lost that election to the Dalbir Bhandari, Britain lost its rights to host two international organizations in London, one to Paris, one to Amsterdam, that very day. And the Chagos Archipelago, take the example of Mauritius, the UN General Assembly voted against British presence there. So it was an indictment of Britain. So when you are diminishing and the tide is flowing against you, whether it is real or virtual, to me it doesn't matter, because as I said, the diplomatic pathways are extremely slippery. So this is in a way a kind of debate that's the wrong kind of debate, because it's going to happen anyway. Let me give you another example, if I may take a moment. You had the virtual summit in the bilateral space between Prime Minister Modi and the Australian Prime Minister. What happened? In the virtual space, usually it is the case that if the issues are easy to resolve, you do it in the virtual space and the procedure takes its course and it's all very smooth. But if it is some intractable problem, some delicate issues involved, some controversial or contentious issues involved, you need to talk face to face, because you need to talk to a human being, try and persuade him. You need to cajole, you need to seduce, or you need to coerce, or a combination of everything. That's what diplomacy is. So here, what happened? It was virtual, but it was a done deal. Everything had been negotiated, and the two prime ministers were supposed to meet in January, actually, this year, and then in May, and both times it was postponed. So it was all under wraps. And let me tell you that in the real world of diplomacy, diplomats work very hard to reach the agreements, to short of signing on the dotted line, to have everything sooner, everything done. All you have to do is have the photo op and the big occasion, because you have to show results, and politicians have to show results. So it would have happened in the virtual space, and it would have happened in the real space. So that's my answer to your question about virtual diplomacy.
Okay, all right. Taking the discussion forward now and coming back to the UNGA, Professor, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, and like Yoshita also mentioned, this would have been a historic, occasion of the UNGA, 75 years and all. So what does this mean for the UNGA?
I think, very interesting question you have asked. First thing that I would like to see, some of the things which previous speakers spoke, I tend to agree with them. But I think things are changing as far as UNGA is concerned, and we have to be sensitive to that change. Things are changing as far as United Nations itself is concerned, the Security Council. Now let me talk about the change first. You see, you never had 193 members in the United Nations in General Assembly. So now it's a perfectly democratized and universal organization, and that to my mind is a very major change. Similarly, United Nations General Assembly has powers to elect non-permanent members, and that is very important. So non-permanent members of Security Council will go from General Assembly, and that's how developing countries have got the power which is necessary to exercise. Another thing that I feel is, things are actually changing in my view, because, this organization also is linked up with many other regional multinational organizations, multilateral organizations. For example, G7 group. India was invited to be part of G7 group, and they're also thinking of making it into G11. So there are certain countries which have achieved that importance because of the emerging capacity, like India. Tomorrow it could be Indonesia. They will also be part of the group. So all these are potential candidates to become members of the United Nations Security Council, and that is also changing as far as United Nations is concerned. And India has to also canvass among General Assembly members to see that it is able to ensure the membership. The third point that I thought I should make, and that is relevant, that things are changing, because earlier you had United States and the Soviet Union bipolar world. Subsequently, United States had backing from Britain and France. Soviet Union had no such backing, but it was standing apart from China. Today, the main context at one level, the contest is between China and the United States at the level of Security Council, and China is also important party and a member of General Assembly, where it is mobilizing the members of the General Assembly on several scores. The third important point that I thought, or fourth, which I agree with Ambassador, some of the issues which are there, they remain the same. I give you two examples. One is, two countries, for instance, are knocking at the door of General Assembly, Taiwan, and China is disinclined to think in giving membership for Taiwan because they consider it an integral part, and every country has a right to its own opinion. And similarly, a very long drawn out case, if you look at, and that is Palestine. What kind of status Palestine will have, we have debated over for so many years. And Ambassador will bear me out. Earlier they used to say it is non-member observer status. Now, non-member observer state, but then do you recognize Palestine as state? Similarly, United Nations also has to think over in current crisis once more, because Yoshita Singh is now right in New York. At one stage, they conceived of Zionism as racism, and today racism and spectre of racism is haunting the entire world, and United States is really torn because of it. And look at the way they're facing realities. Once again, the ideas related to black and white, construction of race, and us and others has come up so strongly across the world because United States has become epicenter of this. So all these issues will get reflected in General Assembly, whether they're pre-recorded statements or open statements when people gather like others. So it's a unique General Assembly in for 75th time, and we are expectantly watching to see some kind of results out of this.
Okay, before we get to results, let's talking about the larger spectrum of virtual diplomacy. Yoshita, the ambassador alluded to that, the first ever bilateral virtual summit between India and Australia. Are we going to see more of this in the days to come, as physical distancing seems like it's going to be the norm, at least for the immediate near future?
Yes, absolutely. I think nations, governments, and organizations have adapted to this, because it's hard to imagine. I mean, something that has been going on normally for so many years, people gathering and meeting. It's hard to imagine that that can be the case again in the next months, because if the coronavirus situation is improving in the US, the cases are rising in India. So I think virtual is the way to go for the time being, at least for this year, for sure, because no country wants to risk to see a spike in the cases. And people have adapted, governments have adapted. At the United Nations, I've been covering the UN for 9 years now, and the virtual UN platform that we've all adapted to, whether it is daily noon briefings, it's all on virtual platforms. There were obviously initial hiccups, getting used to technology, ensuring that everybody is on the same platform. But over a period of time, people have gotten used to it. And going forward, this will be the way, whether it's how we conduct the UN General Assembly, whether it's also going forward with the UN Security Council elections. I mean, that's not virtual, but arrangements have been made for a voting process to ensure social distancing guidelines. And I think it's also important to ensure, and that's what the UN officials here are saying, that the work has to continue. I mean, despite the fact that people cannot meet, world leaders cannot gather, but that does not mean that they have to stop the work. For instance, the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, made sure that the work of the United Nations continues despite the fact that world leaders cannot gather. And they said that it's important because People need to hear world leaders on a multinational forum to see what they have to say about the coronavirus pandemic, of how it has impacted their countries. Because at the general debate in the General Assembly, I mean, that's what world leaders come to the UN for. They outline their national, local, and multinational priorities, and that continuity is very important during these times to ensure that governments share thoughts and the process carries on, because that's what's it's required. The pandemic has created havoc in all the countries in the world, but it's also important to ensure that work goes on and people work together. There's need for solidarity, unity, at this point of time. And I think carrying forward the General Assembly, even though in a virtual format, will give a sense of sort of continuity and normalcy that nations need right now.
Absolutely. I think that's the key, really, as far as nations and the entire world is concerned, to get some semblance of normalcy, really, and get on with our lives. Yes. Ambassador, the UNGA president has spoken about how pre-recorded video messages will be played at the UNGA. Do you believe that that is going to have the kind of impact that that is required at something like a UNGA? Do you believe that that's the best way forward? Why not have live sessions, maybe?
Well, pre-recorded messages are, again, in the virtual space, the speeches are probably going to become shorter. That's my hunch. That's my feeling. Everything will be shorter. What we have seen so far, and people who have observed the meetings in the United Nations, virtual meetings since March after the pandemic broke, have noted that most of the speeches have become more businesslike, more practical, more brief, more concise. We don't have theatricals. Theater is very important in the United Nations. So the answer to your question is, we are going to miss that. We're going to miss the fun. Meaning, country A is bad-mouthing country B in a very polite language maybe, but they're still bad-mouthing them. And, we've had leaders thumping desks and using language that is borderline in the past. I won't name them. So this sort of thing, is it going to happen in the virtual space? Probably not. Now, the fun of walking across the alleys and the corridors and having a coffee and pleasant banter and joking and cutting a deal, this is what actual diplomacy is. In fact, all decisions are made much before the formal events take place. The deal is already made. You are formalizing it on that platform through a process. And process is very, very important in diplomacy. Diplomacy is very structured so that we don't come to blows, not literally, but figuratively. We have to follow certain protocols, certain points of order, certain turns to speak, etc. It's all alphabetical. It is all orchestrated. Now, this kind of thing happens whether it's virtual or real. But the fun thing is, the real decisions are made over dinners, and you will be able to, ma'am, bear this out. You've been observing the UN, and I have been in London. I was dealing with, I'll give you an example, IMO, when we were negotiating greenhouse gases emissions from ships. And then India took the stand that we have to revisit the Kyoto Protocol. Means everybody has an obligation on this, but these are differentiated, not equal obligations, not proportional to your total population, but per capita, differentiated obligations. It was going to be difficult because the organization had gone far down the path. But then we had unexpected support. When we took a very strong stand on this because of our own interests, people actually came to us, said, "Oh, well, India, you're saying this. We are so happy about it. Can you do this in a virtual space?" I don't think so. So this is a kind of problem that's going to happen. Look, let's revisit history. In the 1860s, what happened in Britain? Lord Palmerston said, "Oh, the telegraph, the telegraph had come," and he said, "Oh no, this is the end of diplomacy. We're not going to have traditional diplomacy." But no, this was not the end of diplomacy. It's not the end of the world. The pandemic, which is the cause of all this, is not the end of the world. It's an evolutionary process. We are evolving and we will adapt and we will change. So what will happen in the virtual space? We are already seeing the results. More power to governments? Probably, because the General Assembly is not voting in the traditional way.
Right.
Now, voting takes a couple of days through a written process. So if you want to take a very urgent decision, maybe you can't. You have to wait for the vote. And maybe this gives respite to powerful countries to disregard the decisions of the General Assembly. These are the sorts of problems that are going to happen. I think some kind of authoritarianism, and the powerful will probably get away with a lot more. And you don't have civil society watching over you. You don't have those kinds of opportunities in the virtual space. You have thousands of people coming to the UN every day. So these are the kinds of things that I think will happen. And we don't know how it's going to evolve over the next 2 or 3 years, because everything depends on the pandemic. Eventually, it comes down to the pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah, please do.
I just wanted to add to your point of, going live and having world leaders speak live. I mean, a lot of logistics are involved in there, given the different time zones. And usually the speakers for the Brazil is the first speaker, followed by the United States. And then it's usually on a first come, first serve basis as to who put in the requests. So it's kind of difficult to have a live speech, so to say, because they need to put everything in order. And with pre-recorded messages, it's just easier for the technical department at the UN to ensure that it's all set up. There are no technical glitches once the message is being played. But it will be interesting to see how the right of reply happens at the end of the General Assembly debate. I mean, we can obviously expect Pakistan to raise Kashmir and other internal matters of India. And that was something that's a back and forth that happens at the end of the day of a General Assembly debate. So that will be interesting. Probably that could be live, because you can't have pre-recorded messages on the right of reply front. So, that will be interesting to see how nations adapt to that. Probably Zoom live right of replies at the end of the day. We'll have to wait and see.
Absolutely. I was just going to come to that, but you seem to have stolen the words right out of my mouth. So let me take up another aspect with you, Professor. This terrorism is spoken about when it comes to every summit, be it bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral, call it what you want to. With virtual summits, there could be another aspect, a security aspect, that of, online terror as well coming into the fore. And these are some things that need to be looked at and addressed as well, don't you think?
I think, I would say two things are important for the General Assembly. One is they have to carry on and give continuity to their own agenda. And that is the millennial goals of sustainable development, where they promote rule of law, gender, and human rights. But apart from this, terrorists also, of course, affect human rights, and they affect polities, societies all over the world. And this is a very vibrant issue which will be debated very continuously among states, within multilateral as well as bilateral forums. But United Nations is a major forum to do all this. Now, I can tell you one thing, that if you look at terror, there are comprehensive definitions of terror also. But then all nations necessarily do not accept. There is also another problem with it, that you have various kinds of terrorist groups. One related to perhaps large multinational terrorist organizations like the Al-Qaeda, like Islamic State, which are connected organizations, obviously Boko Haram, El-Shabaab in Africa, or you have Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-e-Dua in Pakistan. But the point is, when the terrorism issue comes up, because of the politics of all these countries, there is a problem. In the sense, for a long time, China was not willing to concede certain demands of India, as far as Jaish-e-Mohammed is concerned, and they were not willing to identify, brand them. So it is the kind of problem. They had it in Security Council. They may express themselves in the same way in General Assembly also. Because as Yoshita Singh was raising, that again they will mischievously try to play Kashmir card and bring the kind of problem of human rights, and the terrorists are coming because human rights are affected. All these are one of the kind of set of debates India has to prepare itself, and also what kind of response India can give in terms of counter-attack. Whether it's related to border issue with China, or it's related to Pakistan and its constant support to terrorism. That Indians will have to think very closely. But let me not confine to India, China and Pakistan. I think there are several kinds of issues related to millennial growth, related to climate change. They are more significant, and they are going to crop up. Climate change is bothering every one of us, and most certainly and most significantly, I think till everybody in the world and universally we are not able to get rid of this COVID-19, I think this will be the primary focus of all countries. I think because of this, all economies are getting affected. Unemployment is soaring all the time. You see so many deaths, and country which will be hosting the summit itself has already more than 350,000 infected people and more than 105,000 dead people because of COVID. So, this is going to matter. India is also one of the countries which is affected by it. Italy, Spain, Britain. Tell me the country which is not affected. So at the moment, setting aside the issues including terror, fighting the tensions which COVID-19 is giving will be central to the agenda, but terrorism will surely feature, and bilateral and multilateral debates on terror will occur, and India will be placed precariously, but will come out of it too. We have always our own ways of ducking and getting through, and India will do it.
Okay, I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so I'm going to ask you, my panelists, to be brief in their concluding remarks. In 30 seconds each, what's the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador?
Well, the best way forward is not to overthink this, because let things evolve. We really don't know. We should not be speculating about what's going to happen, but we should be doing due diligence and in the best way possible, take it forward. And we have to prosecute our national interest. There's no doubt about it. And as I said, the General Assembly decisions may be thwarted by more powerful countries. And how do we protect ourselves? As India, for example, how do we protect ourselves? We have to be very careful about this, because we will be most probably a non-permanent member of the Security Council, but we are not a permanent member with a veto-wielding power. So we have to work together with everybody and try to build relationships as if it's the real world out of the virtual. And that's going to be the big challenge.
All right, Yoshita.
Yeah, so Frank, I would just say that countries, like I said, they've adapted, governments have adapted, and it's going to be a new normal. We cannot return to the life that we were so used to for all these years. It's going to be a new normal of how we conduct business, how nations run their work, how diplomacy happens at the UN, multilateral or bilateral. So it's going to be a new normal, but it also has to be made sure that all the other agenda, the sustainable development goals, like the professor pointed out, multilateral diplomacy, working together to find, whether it's to find a cure for COVID, whether it's to move people out of poverty. All those goals still are there, irrespective of the pandemic. And going forward, it has to be a new normal as to how countries work together to ensure that how they come out of this pandemic that the world is now facing.
Okay, all right. And Professor, close the show for us with your quick concluding remarks.
I agree with what Yoshita was saying, basically. I would only add one more point. And that is, India has to constantly lobby with all the members of the General Assembly wherever they can to kind of push through the agenda. And one of the important things in the agenda of India has always been how India gets membership, and that is permanent membership of Security Council. Because in the long run, it will be desirable, important for India, and also it will be more democratic and representative as far as United Nations is concerned. And that's how perhaps India's voice should count, and it can become more representative body. COVID can be fought. The rest of the problems related to development, like poverty, reduction of inequalities, they are on the cards. Climate change, I told you, already on the cards. But this is also important, and it has to be pursued, whatever may be the means.
Okay, all right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, business has to go on. It can't come to a halt, is what the panelists are suggesting. Of course, there's going to be a new normal. And diplomacy, as we know it, might not be the same, but diplomacy will continue to exist, because that's the name of the game at the end of the day. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.